Brandon's voice cut through the conference room like a blade. "Pack your things, you're finished here." The entire floor froze, waiting for me to break. I didn't give him that satisfaction. He thought humiliating me over an $8 expense made him powerful. He never realized it exposed the one weakness that would bring everything crashing down around him. What happened next changed both our careers forever. If you've ever been punished for something petty, subscribe and tell me your story. Because this one starts small, but the power behind it wasn't small at all. For 11 months, I lived inside a project that felt bigger than my own life. A $150 million modernization deal that seemed to eat entire seasons without me noticing. Every morning I walked into BrightWave's Charleston office, carrying the weight of someone who couldn't afford a single misstep. Not because anyone said that aloud, but because everyone acted like losing this client would end the company. And in many ways it would. Mara Ellison, the VP at HarborSpan, wasn't the kind of executive you impressed with buzzwords or polished decks. She'd survived 2 failed rollouts from our competitors and walked into our first meeting with the posture of someone bracing for disappointment. She didn't trust easily, and honestly, I didn't blame her. The stakes were too high, and she'd been burned too many times by people who promised brilliance and delivered excuses. Winning her confidence took months. Late-night calls when her team hit walls, emergency travel when legacy systems buckled, and endless hours translating technical chaos into steps real people could follow without panic. Somewhere along the way, she stopped looking at me like another vendor and started looking at me like the one person who actually listened. I never said that out loud, but I felt it every time she lowered her guard, every time she sighed with relief instead of frustration. That quiet shift became the fuel that got me through days when my own leadership barely noticed the work holding their biggest deal together. At BrightWave, attention flowed up, never down. The higher someone sat, the more loudly they made their presence known, and no one embodied that more than my director, Brandon Kerr. He liked to talk about command presence, but what he really meant was stomping around the office, reminding everyone he controlled their futures. To him, I wasn't the architect holding the entire integration together. I was just another employee who should be grateful nobody else had taken my job yet. Sometimes he'd hover behind me while I outlined a migration timeline, pretending to be interested but really waiting for a moment to nitpick. Sometimes he'd brag to executives about his successful implementations he never touched, except when it was time to claim credit. I learned to keep my head down and let the results speak for themselves, because Mara didn't care about ego, and her trust mattered far more than his approval. That trust became a kind of quiet currency between us, something fragile but real. It showed itself in the small moments, like when she flew in after a grueling week of travel and rubbed her temples in exhaustion while we reviewed the final system diagrams. I could see how much she wanted this transformation, not just to succeed, but to redeem the disasters she'd endured before. I felt protective of the process, protective of her confidence in me, protective of the work that so many people underestimated simply because they couldn't see its complexity. Even then, with the finish line finally in view, there was a strange tension in the air at BrightWave, the kind that creeps in when people sense a storm forming but can't name the source. I knew Brandon was circling, restless, irritated by how central I'd become to the client relationship, but I didn't know yet just how far he'd go to remind everyone, including me, who he believed held the real power. The afternoon Mara flew in for our final review felt like the moment everything should have finally settled into place, the kind of day where the months of grinding finally paid off in quiet confidence. She looked exhausted the second she stepped into the glass meeting room, her blazer wrinkled from back-to-back flights, her eyes rimmed with the kind of fatigue only executives who live in airports understand. We were supposed to walk through the last phase of the implementation, the high-pressure migration controls that would determine whether HarborSpan could flip the switch without shutting down their entire operational flow. I watched her glance at the office coffee machine with open disdain before sinking into a chair. "I need something with flavor," she muttered, half to herself. "Not whatever that muddy machine spits out." She wasn't being dramatic. I'd seen her run on fumes for weeks, holding her team together through corporate politics, tech failures, and CEO impatience. She deserved something that didn't taste like burnt cardboard. So during a short break, I slipped downstairs to the small cafe tucked beside the lobby. The place smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, and the barista already knew me from the number of late nights I'd dragged myself down there. I ordered 2 iced chais, one for her, one for me, and didn't think twice about putting hers on the company card. $8, the smallest gesture in a project worth $150 million. When I carried the drinks back upstairs, Mara's relief was instant. "Bless you," she whispered, taking the cup like it was oxygen. For a moment, we both breathed easier. We finished mapping the final steps of the migration while sunlight bled across the Charleston harbor, turning the water gold. She left the conference room with a tired smile, promising to email her final approval before she boarded her flight home. That should have been the high point of the day. Instead, as I walked back toward my desk, something shifted. People glanced at me, then away. Their shoulders stiffened in the way employees do when they know something's wrong but don't dare acknowledge it. A strange hush hung over the office, the kind that makes the hum of fluorescent lights suddenly too loud. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to end-of-day fatigue, but a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. Across the floor, I heard the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps, the hard, performative stomp Brandon used when he wanted everyone to know he was on the warpath. It echoed off the walls, too deliberate to ignore. My pulse quickened, not in fear but in warning. Something was off. Something had already happened, and somehow I was at the center of it without even realizing it. I reached my desk just as Brandon rounded the corner, his fist clenched around a piece of paper, his jaw tight with the kind of manufactured outrage he liked to weaponize. And before he even opened his mouth, I understood that the $8 chai had become something far bigger in his hands, something he could use, something he intended to use on me. Brandon stopped in the middle of the hallway as if he needed the entire floor to witness whatever performance he had rehearsed in his head. His face was already flushed, a deep, blotchy red crawling up his neck, the same color it turned whenever he felt important. He lifted the paper in his hand like a sheriff delivering a warrant. "Care to explain this?" he barked, shaking the sheet so violently the edges bent. I barely had time to read the line item before his voice cracked through the air. $8. You expensed an $8 chai. A hush fell instantly, the kind that makes people freeze mid-keystroke. Phones stopped ringing. Conversations died. Someone near the copier inhaled sharply, like they knew this was about to turn ugly and wanted no part of it. My voice stayed steady. It was for Mara. She'd been awake for... I don't care if it was for the mayor. He snapped, stepping closer until I could smell the overpowering cedar cologne he drowned himself in. "We have free coffee here. You wasted company money." The disbelief hit harder than the accusation. 11 months of work, of carrying a failing deal on my back, of becoming the one person HarborSpan trusted, and this man was shaking with fury over a drink that cost less than a sandwich. "The machine only makes standard coffee," I said, keeping my tone even. She needed something stronger to keep reviewing the migration controls. His laugh cracked out of him like breaking glass. "Oh, so now you're negotiating deals with flavored tea. Do you hear yourself?" A few people looked away, but others stared, wide-eyed, torn between pity and morbid curiosity. He stepped into my space again, lower lip curling like he had finally cornered a threat he'd been waiting to neutralize. "People like, you get sloppy when you think you're indispensable," he hissed. $8 is theft. Theft is grounds for termination." A murmur rippled across the office, quick and nervous. Someone dropped a pen. Someone else pretended to cough to hide the gasp they couldn't hold in. My heart didn't race. It slowed. A cold clarity washed over me, making every line in his face sharper, every sound around us louder. "I'd like to explain the context," I said quietly. "There's nothing to explain." His mouth twisted into a triumphant smirk, the kind a man wears when he finally feels taller than everyone else in the room. "You're fired." The words hit the floor heavier than he expected. For a moment, nobody moved. Not me, not him, not the coworkers caught in the crossfire. It was the kind of silence that hangs right before something shatters. "Excuse me?" I asked, not out of confusion, but to confirm he actually meant to do this. "You're fired," he repeated, savoring every syllable. "Pack your things. Someone who wastes its company resources shouldn't be anywhere near a client." There it was, the dagger he'd been waiting to twist. "You're not special, Catherine. Anyone could do your job." The sting wasn't in the insult. It was in how badly he wanted it to land. I closed my laptop with deliberate calm, the click of the hinge loud enough to echo. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't hitch. As I stood, I felt 100 eyes follow me, searching my face for signs of collapse. Brandon leaned against his office doorway, arms crossed, watching with a smugness so thick it coated the air. He wanted the spectacle, the humiliation, the message, that he could break anyone, even the person keeping his biggest deal alive. I walked to my desk, lifted the small plant I'd kept alive through countless late nights, the framed photo of my sister, my favorite pen. I placed them neatly in the cardboard box HR must have delivered while he was preparing his performance. Not a single person spoke. Silence is a strange kind of cruelty when everyone agrees to participate in it. As I lifted the box, Brandon approached one final time, lowering his voice to a cold whisper meant only for me. "This is what happens when you forget your place." The words should have gutted me. Instead, something shifted deep inside, steady, quiet, and terrifyingly sure. He thought he had ended something. All he had done was open a door he didn't know existed, and even he couldn't stop what was coming next. The hallway felt longer than it ever had as I carried the cardboard box against my hip, moving past people who suddenly found their screens, shoes, or anything else more interesting than my existence. Shame wasn't what settled over me. It was the strange realization that everyone was terrified to be associated with the person who'd just been publicly executed over an $8 chai. At the elevator, I pressed the button and waited, as the old machinery groaned its way upward. That elevator had been the bane of my mornings for years. Always late, always stopping on floors no one requested. Funny how something becomes memorable only when you're stepping into it for the last time. When the doors finally slid open, I set the box down and let my shoulders drop for the first time since Brandon's spectacle. The dim, humming space gave me a pocket of stillness where the noise of humiliation couldn't reach me. And in that pocket, clarity rose. Not a dramatic epiphany, just a memory floating up from the back of my mind with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting for its moment. Section 12C, Competency Dependency Provision. One line buried in the contract language I had insisted on months earlier when HarborSpan and BrightWave were finalizing the implementation framework. I remembered fighting for that clause, pushing back when legal said it was unusual to name a specific person as non-replaceable. But Mara had understood immediately. After 2 disastrous rollouts, she wasn't going to let another vendor swap out critical personnel halfway through a modernization that could make or break her company. She wanted stability. She wanted continuity. She wanted me. The clause made it explicit. If the lead system strategist, me, was removed without client approval before migration, the client had full authority to pause, renegotiate, or walk away from the deal entirely. My name was in the contract in ink that didn't smudge, fade, or bend to Brandon's ego. The elevator chimed on the ground floor, and as the doors opened, it felt like they were revealing more than the lobby. It felt like they were revealing the truth Brandon never saw coming. Outside, the marsh wind swept across the parking structure, carrying the smell of salt and distant storms. I placed the box on the hood of my car and leaned against the door for a long moment, letting the weight of the afternoon settle into place. Losing a job was supposed to feel like failure, like everything you'd sacrificed had been for nothing. But instead, something steadier rooted inside me, something that felt a lot like control. Brandon thought he'd finally proven his authority. What he'd done instead was sever the one thread holding his own stability together, and whether he realized it yet or not, the consequences were already moving toward him, quiet and unstoppable as the tide. At home that evening, the quiet felt different than it ever had before. No alerts buzzing across my phone, no late-night spreadsheets demanding attention, no anxiety clawing at the back of my mind about what crisis might erupt before sunrise. I brewed a cup of tea and sat at the same kitchen table where I had built half the migration plans that were now carrying BrightWave's future on their backs. As the steam curled into the air, I spread out my contract backups, letting my eyes pass slowly over the words that had once seemed like formalities. Tonight, they felt like a map out of a trap I didn't know I'd been living in. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't cornered. I wasn't broken. The Competency Dependency Clause was more than a precaution. It was a lever. And now that Brandon had removed the fulcrum holding a $150 million deal together, the weight of that mistake was about to come crashing down exactly where it belonged. The next morning, I stared at Mara's contact on my screen, the early sunlight stretching across my table. My pulse didn't race. It steadied. I hit call. She answered quickly, brisk as always, but warmer with me than she ever was with my leadership. "Catherine, perfect timing," she said. "We're finalizing the deployment schedule for Tuesday. I need your sign-off on the last sequence." The words stung. She still believed I'd be leading the migration. She still believed BrightWave had the good sense to hold on to the one person who hadn't failed her yet. "That's why I'm calling," I said. "I wanted you to hear this from me directly. I'm no longer with BrightWave." Silence expanded between us, not empty, but sharp. "You were... what?" "Terminated yesterday afternoon," I said. She didn't need the details. She needed the truth. "I wanted to make sure you knew they'll be assigning someone else to the implementation." She exhaled, long and clipped, the kind of breath that meant she was recalculating faster than anyone on our side of the table ever could. "And who?" "I wasn't told." That did more damage than any explanation I could have offered. The absence of information created its own argument. "Let me get back to you," she said, voice stripped of every trace of politeness. She hung up. What happened next didn't take long. 34 minutes later, a number I didn't recognize popped up on my phone. "This is Catherine," I answered. "Ms. Hayes, this is Connor Reddick." His tone carried the calm, concentrated authority of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to control a room. "I'm the COO at HarborSpan. Mara briefed me on an unexpected development." I could hear papers shifting. He had the contract in front of him. "Walk me through what happened," he said, chronologically. So I did. Just the facts, the expense, the termination, the non-existent transition plan. When I finished, he let out a sound halfway between disbelief and restrained anger. "You were fired over $8, he said slowly. "An $8 purchase made for our VP during a planning session for a $150 million migration." "Correct. And BrightWave has provided no replacement, no continuity handoff?" "None that I'm aware of." A pause, heavy and cold. Unacceptable. I didn't need to tell him about the clause. He was already reading it. I could hear it in his silence. The words were right there in black and white. Removal of the lead strategist without client approval authorizes HarborSpan to halt or renegotiate the entire agreement. "Ms. Hayes," he said finally, "you handled this professionally. I appreciate that. Most people in your position wouldn't have had the integrity to call us." It felt important. It was essential. His voice tightened, becoming an instrument. "Let me be clear. We selected BrightWave because of you, not because of their platform." My pulse steadied again, this time with the unmistakable shift of power, leaving one shore and landing firmly on another. "Expect contact from them shortly," he added and ended the call. Connor didn't have to say the rest. The collapse had begun, and it was headed straight toward the people who thought the cost of firing me was only $8. The fallout Connor predicted didn't creep in. It slammed through BrightWave like a tidal surge. Before noon, my phone lit up with 5 missed calls from Brandon, 3 from the main office line, and a string of emails that looked increasingly panicked with each refresh. I didn't open any of them. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. They weren't contacting me to fix anything. They were contacting me to fix themselves. By early afternoon, even the CEO, Stephen Callum, had emailed with the subject line, "Request for discussion," a phrase that only ever appeared when something catastrophic threatened shareholder confidence. I closed my laptop and let the silence speak for itself. Not long after, my phone rang again, this time Mara's number. "Quick update," she said, straight to the point. "We've notified BrightWave we're invoking the Competency Dependency provision. The contract is suspended until they provide equivalent expertise." She didn't bother finishing the sentence. We both knew they had no one who could step into the architecture I had built. "Connor has already escalated to our board," she continued. "We're evaluating alternate pathways. One of those pathways—" She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Involves building a technical engagement division internally." Something electric flickered under my ribs. "And you're considering me for it," I said. "We're not considering," she replied. "We're preparing." I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of that truth settle. I had walked out of BrightWave carrying a cardboard box. 24 hours later, a Fortune 500 company was discussing creating a department around my expertise. Before I could respond, she continued, voice softening in a way I'd heard only once or twice. "Connor wants to meet about a leadership role. He'll contact you shortly." True to her word, my phone rang again before dinner. "Catherine," Connor said, without preamble, "we'd like to present a formal offer." He described the role in clear, precise terms. Head of Systems Transition, reporting directly to him, responsible for shaping HarborSpan's internal modernization strategy, a 30% increase in salary, a signing bonus, comprehensive benefits, equity options vesting annually. It wasn't a job offer. It was an invitation to redefine my career. "We need someone with your vision," he said, "and your steadiness under pressure." My throat tightened, not with emotion, but with recognition. This wasn't flattery. This was validation of every late night, every emergency fix, every careful step I'd taken while BrightWave dismissed the value it was built on. "There's one condition," he added. "We'd like you to start Tuesday." The same day the BrightWave contract would have gone live. The symbolism wasn't just intentional, it was strategic. "I'll need the offer in writing," I said. "Of course, you'll have it shortly." The email arrived within the hour, clean, direct, and resolute. I forwarded it to the attorney I trusted, the one person who had seen the fine print of my professional life more closely than anyone else. She called me back after reviewing it. "This is one of the strongest packages I've seen for your field," she said. "They value you, and not because of a crisis, because of your body of work." Her confidence anchored me. At 7:14 p.m., I opened the PDF again, read every line with the same care I'd once poured into migration plans, and signed. The quiet click of the mouse didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a door opening wide and bright onto a future I didn't know I'd been waiting for. Sunday afternoon, just as I finished reviewing HarborSpan's internal roadmap, my phone buzzed with a number that didn't belong to any contact I cared to save. I almost let it ring out, but something told me to answer. "Catherine." Brandon's voice cracked on the first syllable. Gone was the swagger, the bark, the performative outrage he carried like a badge. What came through the line was hollow, shaken, and frayed at the edges. "Please, I need your help. They're going to fire me tomorrow." I didn't respond at first. I let the silence breathe, let him feel the weight of the consequences he'd never imagined could turn toward him. "When?" I asked finally. "First thing in the morning," he said, swallowing hard. "Stephen called me in today. They're blaming me for the contract imploding. But if you come back, if you speak with them, they might reconsider." The desperation in his voice made the air feel oddly still. This wasn't remorse. This was survival instinct from a man who had spent years mistaking authority for immunity. "Why would I do that?" I asked. He exhaled shakily. "Because I was wrong. You were valuable, and I shouldn't have fired you." The words should have mattered, but they didn't. Not like this, not when they were scraped from fear rather than reflection. "Brandon," I said evenly, "what's happening to you isn't because of me. It's because of the choices you made." It was one mistake, he pleaded. No, I said softly. It was a pattern. Yesterday was just the first time someone with power cared to look. He tried to speak again, but I ended the call, not in anger, but in finality. Monday morning, HarborSpan's lobby greeted me with polished steel, warm lighting, and a badge with my name printed cleanly across the front. As I followed Mara down the corridor toward my new office, my phone buzzed with a text from Talia in BrightWave's finance department. He's gone, fired in the same conference room where he fired you. I slipped the phone into my pocket and kept walking. Some endings don't need celebration. They simply reveal who people always were and who you were becoming all along. It took me longer than I expected to face what that experience truly revealed, not about the contract or the fallout, but about the culture I had worked inside for years. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. BrightWave didn't break because of one impulsive decision. It broke because arrogance had become so normalized that basic common sense evaporated. Leaders like Brandon didn't rise accidentally. They rose in systems that rewarded noise over competence, intimidation over clarity, and loyalty to ego over loyalty to the work. I spent years thinking, if I just delivered enough, stayed late enough, solved enough impossible problems, someone in leadership would eventually understand the value behind it. But arrogance doesn't learn, it consumes, and it doesn't stop until someone powerful enough witnesses the damage. When HarborSpan pulled the contract, it wasn't an accident or a twist of fate. It was a mirror showing exactly what happens when a workplace confuses authority with leadership. Looking back, I can still feel that moment in the elevator when everything shifted. Not because I suddenly felt strong, but because I finally understood the truth. The system I had been trying to impress was never designed to recognize the people doing the real work. And once you see that, you stop begging for fairness and start choosing environments that deserve you. If I had known that earlier, I would have protected more of my time, my energy, and my sense of self. I would have stopped sacrificing for people who never pause long enough to notice. How to get started today. Pay attention to how leaders react under pressure. It reveals more than their titles ever will. Document your contributions so facts, not egos, shape the truth. Don't confuse staying loyal with staying stuck. Notice who credits your work and who quietly takes it. Give your best effort only where accountability truly exists. What leadership behavior have you seen that told you everything you needed to know?